My guest today is Dr. Thore Husfeldt, Associate Professor in Computer Science at IT University of Copenhagen and Professor in Computer Science at Lund University. Dr. Husfeldt also hosts the Cast It podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts, and there's even a video version available at video.itu.dk. Dr. Husfeldt, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I love the show.
So before we launch into this whole discussion about algorithms and social media, which I hope I can keep up with, because I know this is definitely your niche, let's talk a little bit about your podcast, Cast It. What's it about, and why did you decide to start it?
So it's about, I guess, computer science-related issues in a very broad sense. So I think I call this IT-related issues, and it should be about the foundations of it. So I want to talk to academics about what actually makes academics tick. I think this is most of what my colleagues are doing is extremely exciting, and I normally don't get a chance to talk to them about that, apart from, say, at a party over a cup of coffee. And I find these things extremely stimulating, and maybe others do as well. So I thought, let's try to make a show out of this. So this is very much my pet outreach project right now. I do worry a lot about science communication, and this is an interesting new platform, so let's see what this can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely recommend it. There's a lot of overlap, I think, between some of the issues we talk about on this podcast and your podcast, but yours definitely has a more IT computer information system type of background. So there's some episodes on cybersecurity and recent ones were gamification. So definitely go and check that out, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But let's talk a little bit first about exactly what you do. So I know you work with algorithms, but more specifically, what's your research interests?
So I'm in the theory of algorithms, so I'm a theoretician. I design and analyze algorithms. And of course, this doesn't really mean a lot to people because algorithms is still a quite opaque concept. So I guess 10 years ago, I do speak a lot to journalists about algorithms, and 10 years ago you would always have to correct the copy from logarithm back to algorithm, because for most journalists, logarithms and algorithms were sort of interchangeable. It was something with math, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And there's a remarkable shift now that maybe like 3 to 5 years ago, everybody now thinks about algorithms as whatever it is that makes my Facebook feed behave weirdly, or whatever it is that decides which YouTube videos I get to watch. So it has changed from some ill-understood concept that is related to math to some ill-understood concept that is related to social media curation or filtration of information. So both of these are somewhat correct, but not quite.
So let's go then to Algorithms 101 and start with the basics and build up from there. So very briefly, what is an algorithm?
Yeah, careful now, because that's exactly what I teach, so I have hours and hours and hours. So among friends, you can just say procedure. So whenever you say algorithm, just replace procedure in your head, and you lost very little of it. So, and in particular, it's normally a procedure that aims to solve a specific problem, like getting from A to B on Google Maps, or selecting an ordering of web pages, for instance, or Facebook items. So it has a well-defined purpose. It exists to solve a problem or decide something. And it has to be specified sufficiently precisely so that it can be implemented on a computer or a sufficiently precise working human. There's no really difference between the precision with which these instructions have to be formulated. So a recipe is a good example. So the recipe for mousse au chocolat is an algorithm for mousse au chocolat. It's a sequence of steps. Some of them use data, such as flour or chocolate, and there may be repetition in it, like whip the eggs until a specific conditions appears, and there may be selection in it, and if you mess it up, then something else will probably come out. And there may even be different algorithms for mousse au chocolat, in the sense that there may be different recipes that arrive more or less at the same outcome, but have various costs, for instance, or speed.
Like different quality of ingredients.
Even that, yes, absolutely.
And so what does a researcher on algorithms actually do? Like, what's an example of a project that you're working on? We talked about some conference deadlines, but...
Yeah, 2 days from now, yes, exactly. So if that works out, I will be really... And that's actually straightforward to explain. So the specific problem that I've spent most of my past few months thinking about is to find a I guess I can explain it in terms of Facebook. I guess a path is a sequence of friends in Facebook. So if you were a friend of somebody and that is a friend of somebody else and he's again a friend of somebody else, this gives you a path of length 4 in this network. And finding paths of a certain length that do not overlap, so that don't come back to one of the people you already visited. So that's the find a path of a certain length problem. And we actually want to count those. So given a sufficiently large network, I want to count the number of paths of a specific length. And even though this problem is extremely simple to specify and would be very simple to solve also if I showed you a very small graph, doing this for a large instance, such as millions or gazillions of nodes like Facebook or a protein interaction network or the internet is one of those toy problems that we theoreticians have agreed on contains a lot of really, really interesting aspects not shared by other problems. So it's one of the few toy. So we have. It's like Drosophila to biologists. So biologists have certain species that they study the hell out of, and we have certain toy problems that we study a lot. And the problem here is one of them, and I think we have a good idea to do something actually a lot better than before, and we're writing this up, and in 48 hours we're trying to send this off, and then it's just normal science. It will be sent to a conference, and somebody else will look at it and say, this is something we already saw, or this is brilliant, let's accept this, and then it's going to be published, and then my reference or my publication counter goes up by 1. But it's entirely internally motivated. So I'm a classical algorithms theorist, so I think problems are interesting entirely by virtue of somebody else having tried to solve them and failed, as opposed to applied algorithms, which is probably more interesting to our conversation, where people have a specific problem they want to solve, and just want to find the best algorithm that gets them a sufficiently good outcome. So applied algorithm is externally motivated, whereas what I'm doing, algorithm theory, is internally motivated, much like a theoretical physicist.
Right, and so there's a number of things that I want to unpack from that, and one of them, and I'll put a link to this also in the show notes, is that I was looking at one of your talks on YouTube where you were laying out the argument that the core concept behind Facebook's selection algorithm, for example, is actually rather simple math. So as you were just talking about different paths in a network, that the core concept is actually quite simple. So can you kind of unpack that argument that algorithms are simple in theory, but maybe more complex in practice?
Yeah, I guess the Facebook algorithm, certainly the old one, is easy enough to explain. So they called this PageRank, I think, until 2013. And it's almost not an algorithm. You decorate every newsworthy item. So whenever you post something, it's easy enough to classify that in some way. For instance, when was it posted? How old is it? And how far are you away from me in this Facebook network? And that gives me some kind of quality measure that defines the relevance of your post to me as another member of the same network. And then you just sum up these many values of the many posts that are currently available, and you do a weighted sum, and you take the top items from that list and show that to me. So it's just a weighted sum where you take the top items. It's almost not worth calling an algorithm. The algorithmic part is entirely trivial. What makes it useful to Facebook and difficult for us to really understand the details is that by now they have, I think, hundreds of thousands of different signals that they add in order to find this relevance measure. The signals could include your spelling mistakes, or what you link to, or how many Facebook followers you have, or how many people typically comment on your posts, or how many people like me that typically comment on your post. So, and there are probably hundreds of thousands of these different values. So the improvement in quality, if you want, of Facebook's algorithms is not so much an algorithmic improvement, it's more an improvement in the number of signals they have available. It's data collection problem.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to ask, because from the beginning of the news feed in whatever it was, 2012, 2011, I mean, Facebook has grown exponentially. And would you say that when they have all this extra data, is it that they're algorithms are more complex, or is it that there's the same simple principles underlying the algorithm, but that more data points have been added? I mean, does that make the actual math more difficult? Or is it a question of computing power or something along those lines?
The short answer is it's mainly a question about data collection and finding a rule for understanding which data is relevant to the Facebook algorithm and not. And that basically then relies on what it is Facebook wants to optimize. So what is the business model of Facebook? And nobody really knows that yet. What are they trying to maximize? Engagement minutes? Are they trying to maximize number of comments posted by me, or how many ads I follow? It's very difficult for them to decide on what is the service they want to offer, and how do they want to be paid for it. And that changes their business model all the time, and it changes, of course, their quality measures.
Because that's I think there's been a lot of discussion, recently about when we talk about algorithms in Facebook, we're generally talking about what the algorithm selects in terms of news to put in your feed. But I think there's also, and what you just said made me think of it, is that the whole platform is designed for you to do something, whether that's post something out or to have yourself comment. So the whole reward system, I guess, of Facebook is structured around making you do something. It's not just about what the algorithms are showing you. And so, I mean, because of the scale of the platform, I mean, algorithms are driving us humans to interact with the platform. And I mean, how do you see that? Is there anything you've come across where, platform design and the procedures, as you say, of how things are manipulated and displayed, that actually affects human behavior, and whether we pull out our phones and post something is ultimately algorithmically derived, or is it something more complex than that?
So two answers. The short answer is yes, there are entirely easy to understand examples, like Facebook a few years ago deciding that the tiny video games that you could play on Facebook should no longer be used. I always kept my hands off those. But there are very small games that were more or less built into the Facebook platform. Something with farming, I can't remember.
Yes, Farm City or something. Yeah,
something like that. Yes, they made a conscious decision to deprioritize that, so that Facebook was not the place where you went to play your tiny video games, but you should interact with your friends instead. And of course, then suddenly the amount of gaming-related content on Facebook vanished or was removed. So this is probably a deliberate decision from them to change the platform in a different way. The broader question, I think, has a longer answer. So can I take yet another step back, all the way back to the second millennium after Christ?
As far as you want to go.
So because the first really serious algorithmic breakthrough in web content ranking, that's not on Facebook's, that's Google's. That's the famous PageRank algorithm, which is from the middle of the 90s, I think 98 or something. So before that, the web was basically impossible to navigate. It was like a library without any kind of navigation. There were a bunch of books, but they were not really ordered. You could just browse the internet, and maybe you knew somebody who knew where a good book was, but it was very, very difficult to browse it. And then Google's breakthrough PageRank algorithm basically built the company in 98, where the amazing thing was, and today it's not amazing, today this is normal, there was a search box, you typed in whatever you were looking for, like Paris, and you got a really good page about Paris. And not just any page with the word Paris in it, because before the PageRank algorithm, when you type Paris into a search engine, nobody used that, but they existed. When you type Paris into a search engine, you just got some page on the internet with Paris in it, but probably a low quality page. Mm-hmm. But what Google managed to do was to get an algorithmic solution to this relevance issue that was so hard to define, and then there's this great idea that Larry and Serge had to define relevance in such a way that it could be turned into an algorithm. So, and that was the very important PageRank algorithm. So suddenly, from one day to the other, the web made sense. You could just type something you were looking for, and you got a pretty decent ranking of all these millions and millions of web pages by relevance. And the that algorithm is much more interesting than the Facebook algorithms. So I teach that algorithm regularly. It's good fun. This is still understandable, but this requires. I mean, this is good material for a computer science or math student. You'll need to compute some kind of second eigenvector of some sparse matrix. It's really good fun. It's a good example of a non-trivial algorithm that solves a big problem and has enormous societal impact. The good thing, if you want, or the nice thing about the PageRank algorithm is that it's entirely objective. It spits out one number for a web page based entirely on the structure of the internet. Basically, it depends on how many other web pages think this page is relevant, and this seems like a circular definition, but it doesn't make sense. So the PageRank algorithm had this notion of objectivity, that there was one single value attached to this web page, and that was the rank of the page. And if you were looking for a page, that was the page you got, and I got, and everybody else got. And so the web for those few years was something like a public sphere. There was some kind of agreement on what the web was, because there was the PageRank algorithm that where everybody agreed what this was. Then, pretty quickly, early 2000s, Google started modifying the PageRank algorithm and make it more and more individual. And this is, of course, again, this makes a lot of sense. So if you are a Japanese tourist landing in the capital of France and you look for Paris Hilton, you probably are looking for a hotel. But if you're a 14-year-old American teenager in Minnesota and Google Paris Hilton, you probably look at a celebrity that was popular at that time.
Right.
So it made sense to sort of individualize the answer, because Paris Hilton means different things to different people in different age groups of different nationalities in different locations. And all that data is, of course, available to Google when you search. Certainly location is available. So when you Google Paris Hilton while in France, you should get another answer than when you Google it while in Minnesota. And Google by that time already had a lot of data about its individual users, and you can just look at how old is the machine to get a good feeling for what kind of user this is. But of course, if the user also has a Gmail account, you can browse their email to find out what this user wants. So Google increasingly individualized the web by making PageRank content depend on the user. So this idea of a common agreement on how important things was, that went away, and we went from a highly objective concept of the internet or the web to a much more individual, a subjective concept of the internet. And that is an entirely algorithmic decision by Google to go from an objective to a subjective thing. And, well, of course, many people like this. People like me, who are stuffy old academics, of course, strongly dislike this because I like Habermas's idea of an Öffentlichkeit or a public sphere. So I found this terrible, and there was a lot of moral panic about this individualization, which culminated, I guess, in the filter bubble idea a few years later. Again, where now the idea was that the news curation algorithms of Google, and by then also Facebook, offered you the kind of information that was relevant exactly for you. There were these famous examples where the same two different American young males Googled, I think was it Egypt, and one got an entire news feed about the Arab Spring and the uprisings in Cairo, and the other basically got travel tips and I think recipes. Because Google correctly had identified one of them as being a highly political person and the other as being somebody who liked to travel a lot.
And I mean, keeping with that idea of PageRank, I mean, I don't know so much about how Google's backend works or these different algorithms, but let's say you're the teenager who gets the recipes in the tourist version of Egypt. I mean, can you scroll down and then somewhere else will be the more Arab Spring oriented stuff, or should you change your entire search criteria in order to get to that? Or
Big question. Google engineers worried about that a lot. So I talked to a lot of them at that time in this filter bubble moral panic, if you want, which I helped spreading. Because it was a good way to get algorithms suddenly out into the public. So before that, really nobody knew what an algorithm was. But there, in these few months, I was actually able to call journalists and say, this is important. Here, what I've always been saying, algorithms actually make a difference, and you can be scared of this, and there's a societal aspect. And that resonated very well with journalists. So we quickly got this meme of the filter bubble placed in the public sphere. Now I lost track of the question. It was about teenagers.
And basically, if you're shown one thing,
scrolling down. Yeah. So it is just a ranking. So if you scroll down farther on Google's page, you will find the Arab Spring news as well, and vice versa. But this is entirely, of course, a decision by Google engineers what they want to show you and how they want to mix that. There was a button at the top search field of Google at that time where you could click a friendly icon of a globe, and then you will get the global universal PageRank instead of your personalized PageRank. And of course, Google quickly realized that nobody wanted to do that, so that feature went away.
Speaking, I don't know if this feature is still there. The I'm feeling lucky.
I'm not sure. Maybe it is. Yeah, that just gave you it gave you the top hit.
So that was like, I'm going to take the absolute prediction.
Yeah, exactly. And it just gave you the top hit. And it worked pretty well.
Which is interesting, I think, because there's, in terms of how they personalize, I think there's not a lot of transparency there. Maybe from being on talking to some of these engineers, but I mean, in terms of, I have a Gmail account. To what extent is that data being used? We talked to Matthew Oskowski in a previous episode. He was a campaign manager for the Trump campaign, and they were buying credit card data, utility bill information in order to better micro-target voters. I mean, what type of data corroboration or synthesizing is going on at Google? Do you know?
Everything they can get their dirty little hands on, yes. And most of it is very difficult to operationalize, of course. But currently they're buying everything they have, and the difficulty is now making sense of this. This has again changed, and I think we will get to machine learning in just a moment, because again, that's a new algorithmic thing that changed the game a bit. But certainly in the beginning, the difficulty was not so much obtaining data, because people like you and me just put everything into our Gmail, and Google just read that. But the difficult part is using that for something. I mean, how does my Gmail communication with my colleagues or my wife tell Google what kind of Paris Hilton I'm thinking about? It's still a mind-reading exercise for Google to see what I want or what I don't want. So there's one algorithmic perspective here which is still relevant for that time. We have something in the late 2000s, I guess, first decade of this millennium. That is, it's algorithmically much, much easier to find similarity than dissimilarity. So pretend we have maybe 200 signals: age, where we live, education, what kind of computer do we use, what kind of fonts have we installed in our machine, which web browser are we using, how often are we updating our operating system. All this information is basically sent to Google by virtue of the protocols of the internet. So that already gives us a lot of detail, and people are surprisingly stereotypical. So as we know, social science tells us. So when people overlap in many of these variables, so many of these parameters, then it's easy to group them. This is just basically easy to understand math. It has to do with vectors in space. So just seeing that two vectors in just 2 dimensions point in more or less the right direction. It's just a question of computing the angle between them. If the angle is small, then the vectors are pointing more or less in the right direction, and then we can see that these two people are more or less the same. And there's only one way to point in the same direction, but there are many ways of pointing in different directions. In particular, if we now go from the 2 dimensions to 200 or now 100,000 dimensions, which nobody, including me, can visualize, but it's just something we say. So really, to Google, every individual web user is just a vector in 100,000 dimensional space. Some of us point more or less in the right direction because we have the same taste. We all watch Rick and Morty and read A Song of Ice and Fire and have the same education and use Vim and not Emacs and so on. So we are all the same. So we get the same news feeds, or we get each other's Facebook status updates. But you can be different from me in many ways, and that's much harder to do something with, right? You can be different from me in ways that are not really important for what kind of news you should watch, because maybe you're from another country.
Now, that I follow, my kind of reservation is what happens when the algorithms and the rules put in place by them start to shape people's behavior perhaps in a similar way, or their interests.
Yeah, so that's exactly the filter bubble moral panic. As I said, I evangelized about that a lot, but it turns out, and then of course real social science has started to study this. Is there a filter bubble effect? Do people actually change their mind depending on the news they are fed? And it seems to be a surprisingly hard case to make. There seem to be, and I'm on thin ice here, but there seem to be not many social science studies that show there to be a measurable filter bubble effect, because people turned out to be pretty damn good at already filtering their information in the first hand.
I can say from the kind of state-of-the-art social media research that more and more studies are coming out and saying that people are exposed to diverse opinions on Facebook. Whether they take them in is another question.
That's another thing. And of course, it's a two-edged sword. And even though Facebook does its best at keeping you happy by just showing you things that don't make you annoyed, you will have friends that have opinions that you completely disagree with. So certainly for me, the internet is an endless source of pluralism and diversity of opinion, and I enjoy that a lot. I don't know if that's just because I like to argue with people, and that just makes my Facebook feed very interesting or very noisy, or whether everybody has that. I do know that people leave certain social media, in particular Facebook, because there is simply too much dissent, too much disagreement, and then I guess they go to Instagram.
Especially about politics.
Especially about politics.
As I've noted many times on this podcast, when I go to promote the podcast on Twitter and I type in social media and politics as keywords, 90% are just lamenting the state of political discussion on Twitter. So people seem to actively not want it.
It attracts them like flies to... I don't know.
Yeah, yes. That would be an interesting study for anyone listening. Is people who say they dislike politics on social media, do they actually really like it? But so let's go back to the idea of algorithms and that math underpins them. But I was reading, and I don't know how correct these figures are, and I think it was from 2015, that Facebook they have some computer engineers, designing the algorithms, but then they have a good team of about 700 at least. I mean, now it's probably much more with all the controversies around fake news and whatnot, of reviewers who signal to the algorithm how well it's doing. So a kind of testing, speaking of Farm City or whatever, humans in different parts of the world that basically say, yes, I think this is relevant for me, or I do not think the algorithm is relevant for me. So can you speak to that? Like, what's the role of humans in testing or correcting the algorithms?
I'm not sure I have a comprehensive answer here. I know a bit about what is currently being done to, what's the nice word for censor? Curate?
Yeah.
Curate Twitter feeds based on how objectionable the content is. And this is technically interesting work. So whenever I attend these talks, I sort of my algorithmic bone tingles, because this is cool work. Many of the people working at Facebook and also Google are brilliant, really brilliant. They have successfully attracted some of the strongest minds in our field.
People that you know from conferences that kind of got...
or that I had as students. Absolutely, many of my best students end up there.
Huh.
Oh, yeah. And also, of course, some of the giants in our field just moved there. Some of the giants in our field made these companies. Yeah. So they're not dumb by any measure, right? But they have a real problem to solve, and the problem seems currently to be that Facebook seems to be motivated to remove objectionable content, and that's of course not a well-defined term. I'm not sure what they mean by this, and so far I'm unable to loyally represent their position,
right?
Because I think this is just censorship, which is exactly what they should not be doing. But of course, they are a company, and they have one thing to protect, and that is their bottom line. And if their bottom line depends on people not being too angry or hurt, and that's what they need to do.
Because it reminds me of, they had the Facebook highlights, was it, or trends? That was a series of news articles that they hired journalists to actively help train the algorithm And basically, what they said was once they contracted these journalists, and then once they had helped train the algorithm sufficiently, they would be fired, which is not a good working environment for journalists. But they were penalized because they were charged with hiding conservative news, downplaying that, and promoting liberal news, and they had to go testify to Congress, and then that feature was gone. So I'm very interested in this. Algorithms are designed to solve problems, but there's an element of humans that are involved. And even more recently is the development of machine learning or artificial intelligence, where you actually set an automated program to learn how to predict things in the future. Or perhaps I should turn it over to you and let you explain to us what machine learning is.
You're doing fine. I mean, again, this is either an entire course or 5 minutes of playing of being extremely imprecise. Mm-hmm. I guess I can go back to my mousse au chocolat example. So if I were to machine learn the recipe for mousse au chocolat, I would start basically with no information about how to make this or any other dish. I just know that the operations that are available to me are to mix some ingredients, maybe heat them up or cool them down, or whip them, or mix some of the stuff I already mixed. So this gives me, I don't know, maybe there are 20 different operations a cook can do. And I just start by applying them to whatever ingredients I have willy-nilly, and out comes something, probably not mousse au chocolat. And so I feed this to somebody, to a human, and the human will say, no, this is not mousse au chocolat, it's terrible, don't ever serve this again. And then I'll go back to my procedure, which I did write down. I started at random, but I did write it down. I'll change a bit. So maybe I don't take 2 eggs, but I take butter. And I don't heat it up to 500 degrees, but to 300 degrees.
Probably a good move.
Probably a good move, thank you. Okay, so we can start one step ahead already. I do it again and serve it again. It's still not mousse au chocolat. I'll change something else. This time I add some chocolate. And maybe the human now actually is slightly happier because the chocolate at least gives it the right color. So the human says, still not mousse au chocolat, but you're getting close. Now, this would be an insane way of learning how to make mousse au chocolat. But the fine thing with computers is that we can simulate 200 million cooks doing this for 5,000 years. And if we just try it often enough, then we will have machine-learned mousse au chocolat. So at the end of this process, I will have found some very weird, probably very roundabout way of adding these ingredients, probably doing many things that were not necessary, right? The part where I throw X at the windows, but they didn't harm anything, so I never remove that part from my recipe. Every time I make a mousse au chocolat, the windows will be very dirty, but some kind of cake comes out of it, and the user may be happy. So that's the role of the user, right? The user should help me understand the role of the human that trains the machine learning algorithm is to basically say, yeah, this is closer to mousse au chocolat than you were before. And this is called machine learning. So it's entirely dumb, if you want, or a guided random process that arrives at an algorithm that is typically not very clean. So to somebody like me, a theoretician with a strong mathematical bent, these things are just disgusting spaghetti code, very, very weird weighted sum of various actions. I can't really see why you're doing this, and nobody can explain why a machine learning algorithm does this. So they are, in some sense, inherently unexplainable. You can't look at the 300-page description of the final recipe on page 136. You do this, why? And nobody will be able to explain it. Mm-hmm. We'll just be able to say, it just turned out to be the right thing to do in this context, and the end result was basically what we wanted. So that's it. So it has a completely different role than the beautiful short recipe that you can find in your cookbook, where every step makes sense, and somebody has optimized and said this is the right way of heating the chocolate, for instance. So in that sense, machine learning algorithms are both more and less mysterious than classical algorithms.
And this leads very well into my next question, which has to do with a new regulation that the European Union has put into place. It comes into effect in 2018, and it's called the General Data Protection Regulation. And part of that regulation includes what's called the right to explanation. And what that means is that a user can ask for an explanation for how an algorithmic decision was made about them. So why was I shown this content? Why was I shown this ad? And given the complexity of machine learning algorithms, and also what you just said about how it's very difficult to explain why the machine learned that way. And that would signal to me that it's hard to backtrack and explain something. So how would how would this regulation even be implemented?
I have no idea. It would be strange if this first attempt was the final way we're doing this, but I think this is great. This is exactly what we need. For two reasons. One is maybe just the aesthetic reason, that I'm sort of, in some sense, appalled by these machine learning algorithms that turn out to often be much better than what I come up with on my piece of paper. Of course, the machine learning algorithms do solve the problem that Google had with suddenly having 100,000 signals to use, because nobody cares really what the rule is. You just put it into this opaque algorithm, it crunches away for a few days, and out comes a slightly better page ranking algorithm or a slightly better individualized filtering algorithm in Facebook. And whenever these companies have access to 50 more signals about you, they just buy that and throw that into the machine learning algorithm, and it will slightly improve again and become increasingly opaque. So to me, it seems obvious that a machine learning algorithm will never be it will never be explainable like a classical algorithm is. So, and explainability is a very new thing. So 10 years ago, explaining algorithms was a non-issue, because all algorithms were explainable, because they were designed by people like me with proofs behind them. We not only explain them, we prove mathematical theorems about our algorithms, so they were extremely explainable. And now suddenly machine learning took off fantastically. They can do amazing things because machine learning algorithms they have reached this pinnacle of human civilization, which is recognizing pictures of sleepy cats and differentiating them from pictures of dogs. And people like me still have no idea how to do that. But machine learning algorithms just did that because we live in a world where 200 million pictures of cats are available, and you can feed them to the algorithm, and then that makes it easy to learn them, because there's so much data today. So the avalanche of machine learning is mainly a consequence of the avalanche of data that suddenly has become available. And then there's some crunching, so yeah, computers have become faster. So we couldn't do this in the 60s for two reasons. We didn't have fast enough computers, but we didn't have enough pictures of cats in the 1960s.
So if I understand your argument correctly, that the massive avalanche of data, as you say, makes this possible, but it also does a better job than humans in solving these problems.
If by better you mean it's better at stereotyping your conceptualization of what should be censored or something. Mm-hmm. But yes, they are in that sense better. They are better at inducing the rules you were following. Here's another example of an opaque algorithm versus an explicit algorithm. The officer at the border, it's probably not a policeman, the border officer.
Border guard.
The border guard.
Mm-hmm.
When you try to cross the border, he or she will inspect your passport, and depending on maybe which country you're from, maybe you need a residence permit or a permit or a visa. And if these papers are in order, then the border guard will let you into the country, following a completely open, transparent set of rules. So imagine another learning border guard was standing next to this first border guard for maybe, 1 year, and observing the first border guard.
Border guard in training.
Border guard in training, let's call him Bob. So Bob has been observing the professional border guard for 1 year and induced the rules that the professional guard seems to be following by just looking what he does. So he seems to look at some piece of paper and says a few words to them, and then sometimes people come in and sometimes they don't. So with enough time, Bob will be able to induce some kind of hodgepodge of rules that 99.9% of the time has the same outcome as what the border guard had. But in crucial moments it will not, because what Bob does is, of course, just stereotyping. And probably lets in people in the country of the same of the right age or color or dress code, and this, I guess, then comes back to the democratic ideal that you mentioned at the beginning. The outcome of these two border guard algorithms is more or less the same in almost all cases, but the first is following a set of transparent rules that we can challenge and can have elections about and can be part of the discussion and can be part of the next election campaign. And the second is basically just stereotyping. He's inducing the rules that we were already following, and this perpetuates good behavior, but it also perpetuates bad behavior and makes it impossible to see why did you not let this person cross the border?
Right. So Bob is not necessarily accountable for his actions because he's never been given the actual terms and conditions that have been basically developed through popular sovereignty or through state control.
Yes. So now we're finally back at politics.
Yes, we are, and we'll continue on those lines. But I have a mega question for you that I want to ask about artificial intelligence. But I'll save it as a carrot for the listeners to stay tuned. But
killer robots or
yes, along the lines of ending the world via artificial intelligence.
Good.
We'll get there.
Good.
But I want to ask also about this transparency and European Union, which is one of their guiding values is openness and transparency. Do you think the current lack of algorithmic transparency is a problem, both in the EU and elsewhere?
So now I'm talking as a citizen and not as a researcher in algorithms. Yes, I think this is a very big problem, and this is one of the things where I guess this is one of the moments where we can decide how society is going to continue. Do we want the algorithms that rule our society to be as transparent as the laws that rule our society? So since in the democracies at least, we have a rule of law, which is an agreed on set of rules that are open to criticism and rejection and elections, since algorithms now suddenly have become operationally very significant and regulate our lives in all details, not only news curation, but also what is your insurance policy, how long is your prison sentence going to be, and many of these decisions might as well, and some are, be done by algorithms, and some of these might as well be machine learned algorithms. And do we want that? And if no, why not? And I guess this all goes back basically to the rule of law and transparent law. I guess there's a famous Harvard professor who has this as a meme: code is law. Mm-hmm. Computer code, or if you want algorithms, should be understood as law.
Lawrence Lessig,
very good.
Who also ran for president in the Democratic
I guess he
Party?
did, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
he did. He did for some time. Yes. I guess maybe this is his election cycle, 2020.
And he's also has some kind of visiting professor position in Lund. You should totally have him over.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know he was there. Yeah. Cool. So, not getting to the artificial intelligence end of the world yet, but again, it's keeping on this idea of accountability. When these algorithms start learning themselves, the machine learning process, they take in human input in order to learn. Do you think there's a danger, I guess, that when you look at platforms like Facebook or Instagram that are so algorithmically driven, again, with human input, can they act like a train without brakes and perhaps learn wrongly to the point where, there's so much data on Facebook, there's so much information flowing that it's hard to sort everything out. Algorithms try to do that. But I guess, is there a devolution of control, would you say, from the platform providers to the algorithm?
I guess they can see that. I guess YouTube is pretty aware of what kind of pathways of clicks or links you follow to get from some perfectly innocuous video via 3 or 4 steps, and then you're in some kind of downward spiral where you just get increasingly agitated people shouting at their video camera at home. I assume that YouTube has quantified this, and well, as long as it's about engagement minutes for them, I guess they are happy. Mm-hmm. But they also need a revenue stream. So I think for a while this is and will remain something that is in private hands, private companies that have incentive structures that are not perfectly aligned with the idea of building an open society. I would assume or hope that there will be more and other actors, that sort of the platforms will be more diverse. There will be more, like there were more newspapers for a while. There might be more channels of information instead of just having YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter as we have now. We will see where this goes. For me, it seems as if this is something that nation states should impact, and hopefully positively impact in the direction of the open society. Currently, so while I'm probably I used to be very concerned, or at least pretended to be very concerned about the effect of algorithms on news filtration, and I think I've changed my mind slightly after talking to social scientists who simply know better. What currently worries me much more is I guess tribalism. So I guess the story that I started to tell from Google to Facebook to where we are now was the story of an originally very objective platform where we all agreed what the public sphere was, to a highly subjective platform which was very individualized. Everybody was their own bubble and everybody just got the information they wanted. But now it seems to be extremely tribal, because currently it seems to be that many people are just using this not so much to gather information, but to virtue signal to other people about the information they gathered. Mm-hmm. And this seems to be... I can't see how that can... I can't see how we can build a society like that, because if these platforms just become virtue signaling platforms, or platforms that increase our tribalism, then I don't know what to do. So this worries me a lot. This seems to be more a human problem than an algorithmic problem. I would expect there to be some kind of algorithmic nudging that makes it harder for people to be so extremely tribal. So the very easy way that we currently have of expressing support and seeing what other people have supported seems to be an invitation that panders to the darkest aspects of our psychology. So we are tribal, and there's a good evolutionary reason for us to be tribal. And when we were just 30 or 40 people in our tribes, this made a lot of sense. But it can't work in a global society. Tribalism will kill us.
Yes, from a global society. Let me provoke you with a question from political science.
Hit me.
Which is, to what extent does the electoral system have to do with this? I would say that this tribalism could work and maybe even be beneficial for proportional representation systems like the Netherlands that have 28 different parties, and then tribalism is a way to signal your affiliation. And the classic example, if you're a minority group, then you can signal your tribalism to others. Whereas I think it's a problem in a two-party system or a one-party system, like a two-party system like the U.S., where that tribalism fractures groups within the larger party structure.
Very nice. I guess that... So there are many things to be said here. Actually, electoral systems are another hobby of mine. There's also an interesting computer science perspective to voting, and electoral systems are also algorithms. They are some kind of decision-making procedure, and I guess it's a good example of the American electoral system reinforcing tribalism in a way that, say, the Dutch or Danish or German system may not be doing. I'm thinking aloud, Jim. This should be translatable to an algorithmic perspective, right? So you just correctly framed this in terms of electoral systems. I think if I was a bit quicker on my feet, I would be able to frame this in terms of algorithms as well. There should be some kind of framework infrastructure that supports tribalism or prevents tribalism as much as it can.
Do you happen to know about any uses of algorithms? I'm thinking about things like gerrymandering and all this data that parties have collected on voter rolls and stuff like that. I mean, can you, for example, devise? I mean, we talked with Matt Oskowski, who's running Trump's campaign, and they developed an algorithm to decide where he should campaign.
Oh yeah. We are exactly very good at that. Right? So the stuff I teach at university, algorithms theory, is a huge grab bag full of cute algorithmic ideas that sort of gives, for instance, could be used for the perfect gerrymandering way. So we have lots of evil ideas, all these very nice, clean problems we eagerly solve for you, but of course we shouldn't, or we can do it, but that's not. That's a good example of something we should not find the perfectly devious idea. I have this dream that sometime I will write an algorithms textbook just called Algorithms for Evil Geniuses, and that would be in there. So that would be an example of an algorithmic technique that could be used by...
You might want to publish that one posthumously.
Yes.
But, and that's interesting. I think it speaks to this, as you were saying, this idea of stereotyping, and that actually... that is, to an extent, easier to identify than the differences.
Very good, exactly.
With angles. And it, before I was a political scientist, I was a philosopher in my bachelor days, and this, provokes questions about the role of reason, where reason has been kind of espoused as, the corrective to these types of things. But if clearly, from what I hear, is that if algorithms can override the idea of reason. I mean, where are we as a species?
Yeah. So I this also takes a lot of my free time. I just finished, what is it, The Enigma of Reason by Sperber and Mercier.
This is what made me think of it. I just started it.
Yeah, fantastic book. And what is so beautiful about so that book lays out very clearly that if you're alone, you can reason yourself into whatever crazy idea you want, and basically you can use data to support that crazy idea as much as you want. So data is not a corrective for reasoning yourself into absurd position. The only corrective so why did reason evolve? Why is this strange human facility there at all? If it doesn't do anything useful for us, it is there for one reason, and that is having a conversation. So that's exactly what we're doing right now, right? So reasoning between two people who have an honest conversation, that seems to be the strongest information gathering and bullshit rejecting device that we have. So we should do much more of that. So, and which is exactly what we're doing. So we're just confirming our biases now. We are doing the right thing. We are saving the world just by having this conversation. Yes,
we are. And speaking of saving the world, and speaking of reason, I want to ask about artificial intelligence and the slippery slope, if there is one, of machine learning, which is, this goes back to a conversation that I've had many, many times over many years with my high school friends, if you guys are listening. We would debate, back in 2010, like, will machines rise to consciousness and take over, like a Skynet scenario from Terminator? And I don't know where I stand on this anymore, but my argument before was no. Computers can be super smart, but they'll never develop reason and consciousness. But I think this kind of, based on that definition of reason, at least in this book, I'm not sure. So I guess my first question is, can machines learn in a way that makes them have the consciousness of humans? Or how do you see artificial intelligence evolving? Is there a danger that machines will overtake us?
This is an entire another conversation. Yes, I just spent some time actually as a guest researcher at a research project about catastrophic risk in connection with AI. So I had an opportunity to develop my own thoughts about this a bit more. It's a bunch of questions. They have a bunch of answers. So first, I guess, let me loyally try to lay out the case for an impeding catastrophic AI disaster. So that case, again, can be made in many ways. Here's one. So for a while, I guess, I can't remember which bird it is. Let's say the cheetah is the fastest animal. And there's a bird which is way faster. Falcon, I think. Can't remember. So for a while, that was the fastest configuration of matter that existed on Earth. It was built by evolution through hundreds of millions of years. And then humans came about and figured out to make a configuration of matter that could move much, much faster. The jet, for instance, or rockets. So we won that game, and evolution failed at finding the best way of moving atoms quickly about. So how does it translate to thinking? And there the analogy would be that it would be extreme arrogance to assume that the configuration of matter in my brain case, or yours, should be the pinnacle of thinking devices. It's highly plausible, actually, that there's a better way of sticking neurons together to make something that thinks than Michael or Thore's brains, or even Einstein's brains, or Alan Turing's brains. So, if true, will we then find that configuration of matter? So maybe evolution finds it. Maybe my three children actually finally are this pinnacle of evolution. But again, probably not. Maybe evolution finds it in 100 billion years just by tinkering with humans. But it's also thinkable that there's a much more engineering approach to find this, and that would then be this scenario of a laboratory developed artificial intelligence. Maybe it's a piece of computer code. Maybe it's genetically modified humans, brains in a vat. Maybe it is simulated brains. So I take your brain and cut it in tiny, tiny particles and write the connections down, put all of that in a computer and simulate your brain, but I speed it up 100 million times. So now I have a 100 million times faster Michael, and I do
I could use that.
and I give you 2,000 of those. Right. So this thing would probably be smarter than any living human, and maybe if I had enough of these things, then they collectively would also be smarter than humanity would be collectively. So whatever this pathway to superintelligence is, it's not unthinkable that it exists. Footnote, of course you might think that human brains are something special because they're imbued by a magical spirit or something. That's a philosophical debate that I think is largely removed from where, for instance, computational neuroscience is today. So if you talk to a neuroscientist, basically the brain is just a computer. It runs on extremely stupid hardware, namely neurons. We don't quite understand what it does, but very few people think that the brain has magical properties. It's just a machine. It's not a machine we currently can simulate, but it's... So from there it follows that it's not unthinkable that we will ever build machines that are better at thinking than human brains are. So I have not said here that I believe us to reach that, but let's just continue the idea of actually reaching this. So let's keep this science fiction-y idea around. So how will society look when there are other brains around that are smarter than we are? They will probably, well, we don't know, of course. We have no idea how these brains will behave, just as gorilla has very little conceptualization of how Homo sapiens works. So gorillas can probably think for a long time. They will not build a good model of how Homo sapiens works. But currently gorilla exists on Earth entirely on the whim of Homo sapiens. So we could tomorrow decide that there should be no more gorillas and that the gorillas are gone. Currently we seem to agree that it's nice to have a few gorillas around, so they stay. But maybe they could easily be gone tomorrow. So what I try to loyally lay out here is the concept of artificial general intelligence or superintelligence to be possible. No laws of physics, no laws of neuroscience, no laws of computation are at variance with this idea. Now, if you think this would be, I think, a catastrophe, I think this would be a disaster, I think we would be gone. I think Homo sapiens has no chance in such an ecosystem. However, I'm also an algorithms person, and I know how terribly difficult it is just to find a good algorithm for finding a path of length 20 in a network, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is a really, really difficult problem with a really, really trivial result. And it's very, very hard, and it's what we can do right now. I can't see how that should lead us to any kind of artificial intelligence. So if you want, mere engineering problem of actually building something like that, I can't see we've made any progress on that. In particular, I can't see that machine learning is even in the right direction. So machine learning is very useful, but it does something that seems to be completely different than what the brain is doing. Humans are exactly not making mousse au chocolat by trying something 200 million times and then being happy with the messy 300-page recipe. This is exactly not how human brains are working. So machine learning, whatever it is not a path to artificial general intelligence.
So we're at the top of the food chain for now and for some time, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Excellent.
For the foreseeable future. If we ever change this, then we have understood so many things before getting there. It's sort of an engineering complete problem. We need to have understood everything else about problem solving before we can automatize problem solving or creativity.
Interesting. Well, I think it's reassuring, and I think it'll be a good place to end. So, Dr. Husfeldt, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insight on algorithms with us.
It was great. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Got a bit heavy there in the end, but very interesting. Very interesting
awesome
stuff.
Brilliant.